Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This is the next installment of my seemingly never-ending Laserdisc collection update videos. Now this video will detail entirely all the discs that I picked up in local stores and all, well basically these are all standard releases, non-box sets, non-criterion, and titles that are separate from the director's shelf video that I did. This will be quite a large video because I picked up way too many discs, or much more than I originally intended to, because one of my local stores in particular got in a disc lot of over 4,000 titles and has been slowly putting them out, and then they started putting out classics for under $1, and I have a weakness, and it's cheap, less than $1 editions of classic films, whether they're on Laserdisc or other formats, but especially LDs, because a lot of these very rarely pop up, especially out in the wild when you're searching stores. So to just jump into these, because there are quite a number of them, and as always I like to go chronologically, but I will start with a double feature, which is one of these really nice MGM double feature sets, but this one focusing on Garbo titles. So this is the double feature of Matahari with the Painted Veil, with this really striking, beautiful cover, with their sort of airbrushed, color-tinted effect they always did at this time on their video releases. This was definitely the spiffiest version to date, and had this beautiful looking gatefold with the traditional MGM design, but really beautiful imagery, and of course both films spread across 2 discs with your chapter stops. Now the films actually run onto each other, so basically the Painted Veil starts on side 2, and this set only uses 3 sides of the 4 disc sides. It does include the trailer for the Painted Veil, because I guess that's the one that survived, and that's really the only extra here. These do have a PCM digital mono soundtrack, so you get the added benefit of digital sound, and this is basically the standalone double feature to go along with MGM's rather lovely Garbo box set of other titles. So this is basically, I guess, 2 films that didn't fit in the box, or they did it at a different time, so they did this nice sort of companion double feature release. Next we jump to 1931, and Picho Reno, which is a Wheeler and Woolsey vehicle. Warner Archive has restored some of their films, like I believe Kentucky Colonels has a nice Blu-ray now, but I've just always meant to see more of their films, because they were quite a popular duo at the time, and this is just the Image Laserdisc release in their traditional style, very generic cover, very much sized for VHS dimensions with the standard generic Laserdisc photo, but this was in really nice shape, still in the shrink wrap. And of course, like most of these, does have a digital soundtrack, so it's got PCM mono, but being Image, you never quite know what the transfer is going to look like. Usually it's pretty noisy, you're rather crummy when you're looking at transfers of films of the classic era, but sometimes they clean up pretty well, and sometimes, unfortunately, this is one of the better options you still have, or if it's got a Warner Archive DVD, it's usually based on this old Video Master. So this is still a pretty solid way to see classics if they have an Image Laserdisc release. Here is the 1935 classic version of The Scarlet Pimpernel in the lovely Goldwyn Pictures Special Home Video Edition. Really gorgeous cover artwork, still in the shrink wrap as part of this lot, and it's credited as one of their remasters at the time. Now these were handled through Goldwyn and HBO Video. They produced a number of interesting LDs like this with the digital remastering credit, although it does claim that they used noise reduction on the audio, and they used early forms of DNR in the picture. So this is the point at which you see even some Laserdisc releases start to play around with those cleanup tools. However, this is I've already watched this, and this is still a rather nice disc. I wish they had gone without doing those, but it still cleans up rather well, and unfortunately this film does not yet have a modern scan and Blu-ray release. It really deserves it, because this is still the best version of what is quite possibly one of the, well, it really is one of the foundations of the swashbuckler genre, and if there is any definitive Leslie Howard role, it is indeed The Scarlet Pimpernel. This is still the best version of the classic swashbuckling tale on film, and the entire main cast is absolutely first rate. So if you've never seen this, or you love swashbucklers and you've never seen this, this is an absolute must. And unfortunately, this is still one of the better options to see it, plus you get this beautiful jacket. Then we move to 1937's Stage Door in the RKO collection. Again, still in the shrink wrap, still in really nice shape, and with a lovely image. This is one of the underrated golden age of Hollywood gems, doesn't get talked about nearly enough, if ever. And if you love any of the classic leading actresses of Hollywood, this is a must because you have so many sharing the same rooms as aspiring actresses. And this is still just an absolute blast every time you come back to it. This is in the RKO Classic Collection design. However, this is a bit spiffier of a jacket than Image would usually do. You get a more extensive essay on the back, but still, unfortunately, no extras. This is when they would start to do some fancier jackets as part of this collection for bigger and more notable titles instead of the usual standard RKO jacket they did with the big black bar on the side and just, the basic text blurb. This does, of course, have PCM mono, so the original mono track in lossless and on the digital track. And this is the best version there is on Laserdisc. This would finally see a DVD release, but has not yet seen a new scan and Blu-ray release from the Warner Archive, and I'm really hoping that happens because this is one of the most underrated. Well, I guess technically it might be labeled a screwball comedy, but it's more of a working girl comedy, if you will, because they're all aspiring actresses struggling to make it, and they're living in a boarding house all together, and crazy antics ensue. So it's got incredible charm, and if you've never seen this, it's an absolute must. Next, also from Image, is The Gorilla, where Bela Lugosi was paired up with the Ritz brothers and, of course, the titular gorilla. This is a very well-known and well-seen sort of horror comedy blend, or really more just goofy comedy with a few sort of horror trappings. But we all come to this primarily for Bela's appearance and the fact that this entered the public domain at some point, so it's seen countless different releases. But this is the major Laserdisc release it got from Image in their traditional sort of generic design, so you can tell this is obviously intended for a quickie VHS release. But it's at least, or at least it should be better than most of the really crappy public domain versions. And it's not a disc you see pop up all the time. So it does have PCM mono, and it should be just one of Image's direct print transfers. So the actual transfer quality is probably going to vary wildly. But sometimes in cases where you have a film that hit the public domain pretty quick, the Laserdisc edition should at least be, a cut above a lot of the others. And, it's not like we have a lot of good official choices for some of these films. So I'm just very curious to check out the transfer, and I couldn't pass up another classic, well-known Bela vehicle on the Laserdisc version that doesn't pop up very often. Next is 1939's Jesse James from Fox. This is the Technicolor Western that pairs not only Tyrone Power with Henry Fonda, but you've also got Randolph Scott thrown in there. I have not seen this in a very long time, so I'm really looking forward to coming back to it. And this actually has a rather interesting jacket from Fox. They didn't do super spiffy jackets at this time. They usually just had a random image sort of taken and used for the use for the jacket. But here they've gone for a sort of tinted photo approach, and then they've also thrown in these other photos, which probably aren't exactly necessary because it kind of distracts from the rest of the imagery, but at least is a sort of move forward in making something for their deeper catalog titles have some greater sense of visual appeal on the jacket instead of just a random image. So I do applaud them for that. We get a slightly spiffed up rear as well. It's still got the traditional Fox layout, but it's at least got a different color, some more images, and then this extra little blurb up here on the top, and a sort of at least attempt at giving an aged paper feel. This was, I guess, a newer transfer at the time, and it does add a digital soundtrack, which is the real chief appeal. So this has PCM mono. This is the best version on LD. It just replaces any previous video version, and this is still, all of Fox's Westerns are underrated and haven't seen a whole lot of video releases, and especially not really very many, if any, with a substantial amount of extras. So this is just, I'm really looking forward to revisiting this film and checking out the LD transfer. Next is 1943's The Fallen Sparrow in the RKO Classic Collection Edition. It's still nicely in the shrink wrap from that same lot. really nice cover image, again, in the sort of standard collection design that that image came up for. So, not the fanciest thing in the world, but once you see a number of these, they really start to grow on you. And this one has the nice sort of additional, making the image look like it's in a photo frame effect. Then the rear is the standard design for these, but it looks rather nice images, and again, the jacket's in nice shape because it's still in the shrink wrap. Like all of these, it does have a PCM mono soundtrack, and I've seen this film once before, but it was a very long time ago, so I'm very much looking forward to revisiting this because I remember a lot of great things about it. This being a sort of World War II film noir where you have John Garfield's character sort of escaping the Nazis and then trying to outrun their agents back in America, if I'm remembering correctly, and just a really wonderful cast that I'm just looking forward to revisiting now on the LD release. Next is 1946's Mr. Ace. This is one of a handful of films that George Raft did in the mid-40s, particularly at RKO. There's 3 films in particular. I have the other 2 on Laserdisc, and this is the second, so this is the one I hadn't gotten a physical copy of yet, so I was very happy to find this. This is part of these 3 B films that are really above average for George Raft at this time. After he left Warner Brothers, never got that same sort of star build-up again in terms of it being a star vehicle film built up for him. But in these 3 films in particular, I've seen the other 2. This is the one I haven't gotten to see yet. But in Johnny Angel and Nocturne, they're definitely several cuts above average, even though they're still B films for RKO. And Image also did this 3rd film, Mr. Ace, which I believe is the second one of the 3. And this is just done as a standalone release, but unfortunately, none of these have a great release history. And because this one's handled separately, it did get a DVD with the same cover art, but that's actually a very hard to find and expensive DVD usually. And I'm sure it's just a port of this master, so I was very happy to finally find the Laserdisc, which also, of course, has a PCM mono soundtrack. So now I'm finally going to be able to see this and thus be able to see all 3 of these, the main 3 1940s George Raft B film vehicles. The other 2 are in the RKO collection, and they have gotten Warner Archive MOD DVD releases from those masters, but this is the one that's the harder to find, and even the LD isn't super common, so I was very excited to finally find Mr. Ace. Next is another RKO title. This one is a real classic. It's not discussed often enough, and it's also a very uncommon LD to stumble across. So I picked up the 1947 noir classic They Won't Believe Me, which did recently get a brand new Warner Archive scan and Blu-ray release. This is a brilliant noir. This is just a phenomenal, interesting film from 1947, so right there in the sort of golden age of RKO noirs. This has a different sort of role for Robert Young. It's almost got shades of how Fred McMurray was so out of his typical screen characterization in Double Indemnity, but you've also got both Susan Hayward and Jane Greer. This is a noir must for all noir geeks. It's got a rather standard cover. This is Image, and for some reason, I guess maybe this predated their RKO collection, or for some reason they just did some RKO titles in their more standard jackets instead of giving it their collection banner for some reason, but it may just have predated their RKO collection jacket design. But this is otherwise the typical Image layout, very generic artwork, but it does at least have PCM digital mono, and it'll be interesting to compare this to the new Warner Archive release. But I just couldn't pass this up because it's a noir classic and it's a rather uncommon LD, so I was very happy to grab this. But as you can see, this is from that collection my store got a little while ago, that the original owner hand cataloged everything with a label maker. So unfortunately, it's got this label on the corner of the jacket, and if you try to remove it, it just rips the jacket. So I just, try to ignore that. But this is already a standard Image jacket anyway. So it was more this being a noir classic and a rather uncommon LD, and it was extremely cheap, so I couldn't say no. Here's another absolute noir classic, Force of Evil, still in the original shrink. This is from Republic in their traditional design at the time with the sort of tilted VHS mock-up art. And here we have a quote from Andrew Saris, not one of the usual critics you see pop up on an LD jacket, but that really selling you on how big of a noir title this is. Unfortunately, this isn't a special edition, but at least it's a spiffier effort from Republic, which they were doing around this time. So we have some nice original poster imagery, and this does have a digital mono soundtrack. So I'm very curious to check out the transfer on this. And I don't know, I just really enjoy looking at even classic noirs I've seen dozens of times, like this one with it's one of the key John Garfield performances. But I get a kick out of seeing them on LD and seeing how the transfers came across, because sometimes that does kind of add to the charm a little bit. And there's just something that goes very well, or goes kind of hand in hand with seeing a classic noir on an old Laserdisc transfer. It's just got a fun sort of grittiness seeing it on an old VideoMaster sometimes. Then comes this rather nice rank edition of Christopher Columbus, starring Frederick March as Columbus. This is one of the sort of seafaring Columbus films I've never gotten to see, and so I was happy to pick up this Laserdisc with a very spiffy cover. Not super common, and I don't think there's too many of the Rank Films Classics banner Laserdiscs out there. But it does seem to very much follow the same design as the Goldwyn films around this time period. It is handled by Image, of course, and it's just the film only, but it's got this nice sort of aged effect on the imagery, and it just looks like a really nice jacket. And of course, this has a PCM digital mono soundtrack, so I'll finally get to see March's take on Columbus and in this production, which does seem to be regarded at least quite a bit better than some of the more modern Columbus films, although no Columbus film really does the actual history of Columbus, which is, of course, quite nasty and not the sort of he was not the sort of heroic figure that he's made out to be in a lot of these films. Let's just put it that way. That's the nicest and most polite way of putting it. But I've been very curious about this, so I'm happy to check it out on LD. Next is the 1950 classic western The Gunfighter, which now has at least a better reputation and knowledge about it ever since Criterion put out their Blu-ray release. So I really like the image here. It's in the traditional Fox style of just having a singular image, but here for The Gunfighter, it works perfectly. This stark, very non-inspiring black and white image very much fits the tone of the film, which is being released in 1950, the same year as Winchester 73. This is where you see the real start development of the more brooding psychological Western that had kind of had films of that type in the 40s. But starting in 1950, particularly with this film, and especially Winchester 73 and the other Anthony Mann films with Jimmy Stewart, this is where the Western really became more honest and upfront about the realities of Western and frontier life, and this is a real classic gem of the genre, and I'm just happy more people know about it now. So I was very happy to find the LD, which doesn't pop up super often, and this is still in really nice shape in the shrink wrap with the traditional Fox design, but they've gone for a slightly different shade of gray. This almost has a little bit of bluish or pinkishness to the actual gray, so it's not the traditional Fox jacket gray on the back. It's got the same layout. We do have at least a little paragraph about some behind-the-scenes production information, and we get the film on a single CLV disc with its original mono mix as digital PCM. So that's always the big draw for me. So it'll be interesting to compare the audio transfer to the Criterion version, and usually Fox transfers of their black and white classics on Laserdisc are really solid, so this is still a fun viewing option if you pick it up, but of course it should go hand in hand with the Criterion Blu-ray release. Next, because I am a giant Bogart nerd and I've already reviewed this film and have a much better opinion of it than most people do, I couldn't resist when I found the Laserdisc of Sirocco, again from 1951. This is the beautifully atmospheric, but unfortunately kind of messy plotted film that is a later period Bogart title where he is in his full world weariness mode. He's absolutely incredible in this film. So is Marta Torin as the lead actress, and then you've also got Lee J. Cobb and even the wonderful Edward Sloan in a few moments. This is a It's kind of almost a cross between, well, it's really like a cross between Casablanca and Treasure of the Sierra Madre a little bit in terms of trying to go for realism, maybe a dash. Well, certainly they were going for the feeling of the third man in terms of a sort of bombed out city under siege in wartime. It doesn't quite work, but the atmosphere is incredible, and Bogart is absolutely sensational and absolutely Bogart, the iconic figure in every scene, but it's that mixed in with the sense of atmosphere and the sense of a city under siege and full of desperate characters that really makes this film have some energy to it, even though unfortunately the plot is certainly a bit messy, and I do wish it was better. I certainly think the atmosphere and Bogart's performance are worth the watch. I did review this in the Indicator Columbia Noir Bogart set on Blu-ray, so you can look at my review of that if you want to hear more about my thoughts on the film. I just picked this up because it's a rather uncommon title, and it does have a PCM mono soundtrack, and I wanted to compare that to what's on the Indicator Blu-ray, just because any film I'm interested in, if I get the chance to, I do like to compare the audio tracks, because sometimes you do find even an old image Laserdisc that's pretty simple like this will sometimes have a really solid audio track. This just has the traditional, very generic image jacket, obviously designed for VHS and then upsized to Laserdisc, but I just couldn't pass up a harder to find late period Bogart vehicle that I like a lot of the elements of. Next is 1952's Scaramouche. This is the MGM reissue with digital sound. This came after Criterion's versions, which had both a CLV and a CAV version. It did have a commentary, so this is just MGM doing their own version later on. Sometimes they did share the same transfers, and sometimes MGM did a spiffier version. And then you have cases like Adventures of Robin Hood, where the MGM transfer of the Technicolor Classic is absolutely insane and terrible because all the saturation levels are jacked up, and the Criterion is absolutely head and shoulders above the MGM. So it kind of varies, but I was curious about this because, again, sometimes the MGM versions are actually better or a little bit better, and this film has not yet received a new scan or a Warner Archive Blu-ray, which it would really be a knockout. Any of the big swashbucklers, and then you get also the MGM Technicolor sort of revisits or remakes, or Technicolor adventure films they were making after things like King Solomon's Mines and Ivanhoe in the early 50s. This sort of little mini rebirth of the adventure and swashbuckler genre in Technicolor would really make for a lot of amazing new HD and 4K masters. But this is definitely the latest version on Laserdisc. This did come after the Criterion version, so you just want to supplement the Criterion edition with this if you're a big fan of the film. And it does have a nice jacket design in the MGM style, with the nice tinted photos and original imagery and a nice usage of the jacket. However, this is film only, but we do get the original trailer tacked on at the end and the original mono mix on the digital soundtrack, so this does have digital sound. This doesn't pop up super often. You usually see the regular standard Criterion CLV more than the MGM version, and I was just curious about the actual presentation on here compared to the Criterion. Next is a Republic release of Blowing Wild, which is a lesser-known Barbara Stanwyck and Gary Cooper Western, also with Anthony Quinn. This was shot on location in Mexico, and it's just one of those films I've read about and just never actually gotten to see. This is not a very common LD, but it's in the Republic design of jackets at this time, so it's a little bit fancier, obviously, than what we saw earlier on Force of Evil, and it actually has some nice images and a bigger sort of description on the back in addition to the chapter stops. And this does very nicely include a digital mono soundtrack. This is, after a certain point, Republic decided, hey, that's actually important, like all the other labels. So that's always another great reason to pick up lesser available Republic titles on their Laserdisc releases, because you're not only getting an official release version mastered from a better source, but you're also getting a digital soundtrack. You do at least get the original trailer here, so that's really your only extra, but that's, of course, most Laserdisc for you. Next is the 1953 Fox costume drama version of Titanic. This is the 1995 reissue with the modernized cover artwork. It adds digital sound and the original trailer, but has a rather nice jacket from Fox and a nice write-up, as all Fox discs do. This is in really nice shape, still in the shrink wrap. Again, has digital PCM mono, and I've just been wanting to revisit this version for a long time. I haven't seen it in a very long time, and most people kind of just skip over this and go straight to A Night to Remember, which is still probably the best Titanic film made. But this certainly has its elements, and basically this has more of the costume social drama, whereas Night to Remember is more, I mean, it's not exactly a documentary style film, but it has more of a documentary style flavor, and the actual sinking of the Titanic is probably best done in that film, but it doesn't have more of the opulence and the sort of social drama of the Fox costume picture. So I've just been wanting to revisit this, and I finally found the Laserdisc in really nice shape. Next comes The Violent Men, here in the lovely looking Pioneer Special Edition. This is a Western I've always wanted to see, and it's just kind of eluded me because you've got Barbara Stanwyck going toe-to-toe with Eddie G. Robinson, and basically with Glenn Ford caught in the crossfire, and doesn't that sound amazing? But what's great about this is not only the first major widescreen release, and this was a CinemaScope film, but as the credits state, this is actually also a restoration of the original 4-track stereo mix. So this will be stereo, but also matrixed out, and you'll matrix it out in Dolby Pro Logic or whatever you have on your receiver. Because this is CinemaScope, they did have 4-track stereo in the original engagements, and this literally credits that Pioneer has unearthed the only remaining stereo print for this transfer, and this is the first time it has been heard in stereo since its original release, and then actually gives the sound restoration credit. So this is not only a widescreen transfer, and the first that I'm aware of, but also it's actually a stereo mix on the digital track, and it is the original CinemaScope 4-track stereo mix, which is really important because unfortunately a lot of these did not survive in their entirety, and most CinemaScope films you're only hearing a mono version for the general release prints, or a upmix or remix of the film into a more modern 5.1. So it's not very often you get the original 4-track stereo anymore. Next comes 1959's They Came to Cordura, which, again, I haven't seen this in a long while. This is the standard image release. This is really, I think, the only release on Laserdisc, and unfortunately it is not in the original aspect ratio, but the real draw here is this does have a digital PCM mono soundtrack. Otherwise, it's just your typical image release, the no-frills cover with the sort of VHS artwork slapped onto a Laserdisc jacket. But again, not a super common disc, and when you start picking up image discs, then you kind of get to a point where anytime you find one cheap and in good shape, you pick it up, if only to check out the PCM digital soundtrack. Next is the MGM Letterbox release of 1960's Please Don't Eat the Daisies, pairing David Niven with Doris Day, and of course the cover just tells you just how ridiculously cute and charming this film can be. And of course, Doris Day in anything is great, and I will watch anything that David Niven ever did because the man was a genius. But this is the letterbox edition with MGM's cover design type at this time, the sort of collage effect, and at least it does have a nice sort of splash of color to it throughout. The rear is also pretty nice, and we get the chapter stops here on the left in pink, and we do get the original trailer. The other major draw, in addition to this being the first letterbox release, is of course it has a PCM mono soundtrack, so this will get you digital sound as well. Also, I found 1960s Where the Boys Are in the MGM letterbox presentation. This is kind of really, I guess, technically the start of the sort of teenage beach film craze in a way. I've seen this once a long time ago, but I just was sort of drawn in because this was not only a cheap LD, but the cover is really nice and a good usage of original poster material in a sort of way that's not typical for MGM at this time. So this is a better than average jacket for them. The rear is pretty straightforward, and we just get the film on a single CLV disc, letterboxed with the original trailer and a PCM mono soundtrack. So I just figured it would be fun to give this a spin and revisit this film. Next is 1962's The Counterfeit Trader in this nice Paramount edition. This is actually a spiffier edition than you'd think, because you flip over to the back and you see all the special credits, because what they did was they actually found and restored the score for this film, and it's stereo, so they actually made a new mix of the film. So on the digital tracks, you're getting this new stereo version where they mix the mono stems with the stereo music source. And then they've also, on the analog tracks, on the left, you get the original mono mix of the film, and on the right, you get the actual isolated score, which they've also nicely put on the chapters and actually, so you have each chapter, then underneath, and in the little red text, it's actually telling you where the actual music cues are. So this is really interesting and not something you see all the time, but it's definitely something they started doing in the Laserdisc era. But unfortunately, this is not a widescreen transfer. You would think they would have done that, but unfortunately they didn't, so it's technically not the correct aspect ratio, unfortunately. I'm really looking forward to revisiting this, because I know I saw it once a long time ago, and the idea of William Holden being in a grittier World War II tale is just absolutely fantastic. So I can't wait to revisit this and also check out the isolated score. Next is 1965's Those Magnificent Men and Their Flying Machines in the Super Deluxe Fox Widescreen Special Edition. Lovely usage of original poster artwork here, with digital sound, of course, but a brand new letterbox master, complete with an extremely extensive gatefold with a full essay and write-up, and your chapter stop breakdown on the side, and beautiful imagery throughout. Which is also important because you do have extensive extras on disc 2, and that is also gone over on the rear, which not only lists the extras and the new transfer specs in the Fox design layout type at this time, but you even have a letter of appreciation from director Ken Anakin, who did supervise this transfer. Now, the actual credits and about the restoration at this time and the extras, we have a new digital transfer in the scope aspect ratio from a pristine 35mm in a positive, a digital version of the original 6-track surround stereo, but of course it's matrix down to Dolby Stereo Matrix as PCM, because this doesn't have, or this predates AC3 or doesn't have AC3. Ken Anakin did a director's commentary on the analog tracks. We get an annotated history of the production, frame-by-frame effects analysis, production photos, storyboards, behind-the-scenes stills, original advertising, and more. And that is why this is a pretty substantial supplemental section, because it pretty much runs the bulk of disc 2. So I'm actually rather excited to revisit this film on the Laserdisc edition, but because this was a big Tato major production, it definitely could use a brand new scan and at least a very spiffy Blu-ray, if not a 4K UHD release. But it's also Fox, and it's locked away under Disney, so I doubt that's going to happen anytime soon. And this was Fox, doing their best at the time with the available Laserdisc format, and it's definitely one of their spiffier special edition releases. Next is a film I've wanted to see for far too long, which is 1974's 11 Harrow House, with Charles Grodin in a sort of caper spoof film of a type, but it's also a film where you have Charles Grodin actually wielding a gun on the cover, and that just take my money now. He also did the original adaptation of this, so he did have a lot of creative input into this film. You've also got him paired up with Candice Bergen, John Gielgud, and even Trevor Howard, along with James Mason, so what's not to love? This is in the traditional Fox rear jacket design at this time, but it's given a sort of pink effect, which I think kind of fits the film in a certain way. And then we also have the original mono mix as digital PCM, which is always a bonus, and of course a letterbox transfer. And I don't think this film has a whole lot of releases, so this is still, I think, one of the best ways to actually see it, unfortunately. And I've just read a lot about it, and I'm very curious to finally be able to see this, and I'm so happy to actually stumble across the Laserdisc release. Next is the much less common Warner reissue of The Gauntlet, the Clint Eastwood 1977 film. This was a 1995 repressing, so it's got the original poster artwork, looks lovely, It has the little Warner widescreen banner actually on here, tucked away in the corner. And it's got the very thick gloss feel, but unfortunately the very thin jacket. So these are very much always going to turn up with some sort of wear because it's a very thin jacket with a thick gloss on it. But thankfully it's just a single disc, so this one has survived really well. No major smushed corners or anything. We get the new widescreen scope transfer of the film with the digital tracks containing what's credited as Dolby Stereo, but I haven't seen this film in a while. I always thought it was mono, but I guess being 77, they maybe sprang for Dolby Stereo, but I'll double check that, of course, when I put this in. We do get, again, the new transfers, the real draw, and having the original poster artwork. They were doing new transfers of other Eastwood films at this time, and most of them did come out on Laserdisc, and then these would get ported over to those early snapper case DVDs under the Eastwood Collection banner. But it is quite tricky to get all of the Warner widescreen master, or I should say widescreen remasters of Eastwood films on Laserdisc, and they don't often pop up, so anytime they do, I'm happy to chip off another one. Next is 1980's The Hostage Tower, which is based on an Alistair MacLean story. It has a really fascinating cast, but really not a lot of video releases. So I think this Laserdisc actually is just about the best you can actually do for this. And I think it's also got a VHS edition, and neither is very cheap or very common. I don't think this has the greatest critical reputation in the world, but I do enjoy Alistair MacLean story adaptations, and the cast looked interesting, so of course this was a no-brainer for me. It's not in the best of shape, but it's just a standard Embassy home entertainment release, and of course will be in a 133 transfer, so sized for 4:3 televisions at the time, and does have analog audio only instead of a digital track, and I'm guessing this will also have a Dolby Stereo matrix, perhaps. At least I think it will be matrix stereo, but I'm not exactly sure. And this being Embassy and not being a super well-known production, it could also just be plain stereo or mono. I don't know yet. And of course, it's analog sound only. But I was just surprised to find this kicking around the bins, and this was actually in their free bin, so I couldn't say no. Next from 1981 is Southern Comfort in the spiffed up Goldwyn digitally remastered classic edition. Really nice cover artwork. This, of course, is the Walter Hill film that I've been meaning to revisit for some time, and so it'll be nice to look at it on the Laserdisc release. The only real problem is this is unfortunately not a widescreen master, so this is 1:3:3, and it is not properly in the original aspect ratio. But it is a new transfer done at this time, has rather nice artwork, has the original audio on the digital PCM track, so you get a lossless version of the original mix, but also this being Goldwyn and from HBO Video, as I said before, you get the little blurb about these transfers have been significantly improved by the careful application of the digital noise reduction process. So the ones I've seen so far with that on there, it's not like they're a smeary mess or anything, but you do see even DNR creeping in at this point in the early to mid 90s. So it's not necessarily a new problem is what I'm trying to say. So anytime I see that, that does make me a little bit leery, but this is the best version of the film on LD. I just wish it didn't have any of that, and I wish it was actually letterboxed, but otherwise it is the best version you can get on the format. Next is the Warner widescreen reissue of Risky Business. Lovely usage of the original poster artwork, looks great on a standard black jacket, and even with the LD logo, they at least made it a sort of purplish pink to match the actual poster, and this is just a really nice, attractive Warner jacket. This doesn't pop up super often. You usually just find the earlier non-widescreen versions, and they did make the Warner sidebar purple, so at least it works with the overall aesthetic of the original poster imagery. We get some nice stills, but the main draw, of course, is this is a widescreen presentation, so it's an actual widescreen master, with the original Dolby Stereo presented as PCM, so you're getting the original audio and what is probably the best presentation of it on home video. So I just kind of held out to get this and revisit it when I got the letterbox version. So I was just very happy to finally pick up the letterbox edition and actually find a copy for cheap that had a really nice condition jacket, because this is one of those jackets you don't want to get all dinged up. Next is the film Silkwood from Mike Nichols. This is the much less common mid-90s Image letterbox reissue. So you've got the original poster artwork reproduced, with the widescreen banner on the top, differentiating it from the earlier non-widescreen versions. This is just film only with a digital PCM soundtrack of the original mix, but you're actually getting a newer letterbox master, and I assume this is probably what made it over onto the film's first DVD appearances. But this from 1995 from Image. It's one of their less common widescreen reissues of a very notable 80s title, so I was very happy to pick this up as well because I haven't seen this film in a very long time, and I figured it'd be fun to revisit it on the much less common letterbox Laserdisc. Moving on to 1986, this is seemingly, it looks more along a Broterian film release, but this is apparently a very uncommon film, and this is really the only way you can see it, which is the HBO video release of Let's Get Harry, which, again, you can feel the Broterianness emanating from this. Even has a nice 5 men risk everything to save a friend. Got a trailer, read the tagline, of course. But this is actually quite uncommon. I managed to find it in one of the cheap bins for less than $1, and seeing as the cast includes Robert Duvall and Gary Busey, Mark Harmon, and even Ben Johnson, and Sam Fuller has a story credit on here, I was like, okay, I have to check this out. And this is also credited to Alan Smithee, so this is a film where the director took his name off of it. So all of this seems to bode well for the potential quality. This is from HBO Video. It does credit having Dolby Stereo processing on the soundtrack, and so this should be stereo with matrix encoding. I'm not sure if this is a digital soundtrack. I'd never really heard of this film before this point, and I just looked it up on the Laserdisc database and looked up the film and found that it was pretty obscure and didn't really have many, if a whole lot, of video releases to begin with. So I just figured I'd pick it up and check it out simply due to all of the people involved in the cast and crew, and it just looked somewhat interesting, but this does look to be a rather budget 133 transfer in terms of probably what the picture quality is going to be like. And I can't remember if this has digital sound or not. I don't think that it does. I think it's just analog Dolby Stereo encoded. I also picked up the MGM letterbox pressing of Running Scared, which I've been wanting to revisit, this being a Peter Hyams film that you don't really hear mentioned anymore, and I've been wanting to go through and look at his lesser discussed films. But this is the nicer, spiffed up MGM letterbox pressing with the original poster artwork. Still in the shrink wrap, looks pretty nice. Very much along the lines of, in terms of the jacket design, some similar looking, I guess, in a way to, say, for example, their Year of the Dragon release, also mid-'80s crime film, a really underrated film. So that's at least what the black background on the jacket makes me think of. Single CLV disc, letterbox transfer with the original Dolby Stereo on the digital tracks, and we do get the trailer, but that's it for extras. This is just a film I'd been meaning to revisit, and I figured I'd pick up the LD when I found a nice copy for cheap. Next is the widescreen reissue of The Seventh Sign with the nice Sony jacket with original artwork. The jacket's in really nice shape, and this is not a super common reissue to find in the widescreen presentation. Now, I have not seen this in a very long time, so I figured I'd check out the LD since I found this nice copy for very cheap. It's got the typical nicer Sony liner notes, a good healthy amount of chapters, but no real extras, so it's just getting a newer widescreen master with the original Dolby Stereo on the digital tracks. So this is definitely the better presentation on LD as compared to earlier versions. And for some films like this, for some reason, it just took Sony a while to get around to making a fancier widescreen version. Now, this one was, this is a film I've never seen before, but I picked up 1990's The Field on this nice-looking LD pressing because it's a Richard Harris vehicle, and he was Oscar nominated for this, and I try to see anything Richard Harris was ever in because the man was always fascinating. And this also co-stars even John Hurt as well, so it looks like it'll be a very nice drama to go into, but I can't resist anything that Harris was ever in. This does have a digital soundtrack with Dolby Surround encoding, but it does seem like it's a 133 transfer, so I'm guessing it's open matted or opened up from the original widescreen matting, because I don't think there's a widescreen version of this. I'd heard reference to this before because I knew he had gotten another Oscar nomination around this time, so I've never really known much about this and never seen it, so I figured I would try out the film on Laserdisc. Here's another sort of blind buy pickup. They actually did have a couple discs in a free bin once, so if it's a cheap Laserdisc, that's one thing, but then if it's in a free box of a couple random discs, well, then I'm definitely, I'm gonna take it with me. So I picked up Little Vegas, also from this slot, so nicely in the shrink wrap, and this just looked like an interesting little whimsical comedy that I'd sort of heard of before, but just never really seen or heard much about it outside of the title and the basic premise. So I just decided to pick this up because it was in the free bin they had one day. But this does seem like a pretty nice pressing. Does have a digital sound with Dolby Surround processing, but I do believe this is also a 1:3 transfer. I don't think this is widescreen. I also picked up Miami Blues on Laserdisc with the very ultra Miami slash 90s looking cover in terms of the colors of the cover art. It looks really nice and very displayable. This is an underrated film. It did just finally get a spiffed up Blu-ray release, but I found this LD for super cheap, so I decided I'd pick this up too. This is not, unfortunately, a widescreen presentation. It is 4:3, but it does have the original Dolby Surround track on the digital track, so you get that in PCM. And again, very 90s looking artwork, which always helps a 90s film. Next, I picked up Revenge, also from 1990. This is the Tony Scott film, the Kevin Costner vehicle that wasn't super well received back at the time. I've seen pieces of this. I don't know if I ever saw the whole thing, but I've been meaning to go back and look at Tony Scott's other films and his lesser known and lesser discussed films, so this was a perfect find. This is the Sony widescreen edition. Relatively nice artwork, although obviously designed for VHS. And then a pretty nice rear widescreen with the Dolby Stereo mix on the digital tracks, and at least decent enough art, but no real extras. And I do think there's another, I guess technically a director's cut of this film floating around as well, so this is the theatrical version, or at least I seem to remember there was some sort of discussion about the edit of this film and Scott wanting it a particular way, and so there's, I think, a couple different versions of this floating around. But I've just always meant to see this in its entirety, and I figured the LD was a good way to do that. I also picked up the widescreen pressing of The Rookie because I'm trying to pick up more of the Clint Eastwood vehicles or Clint Eastwood films in their widescreen Laserdisc pressing. So again, like the Gauntlet, anytime I find one of the widescreen copies, I try to pick it up simply because I just wanted to watch these on Laserdisc for some reason. It just kind of felt right. And this does have the original Dolby Stereo mix on the digital tracks PCM, a nice typical Warner jacket, but looks nice with the red on the side. And they nicely gave us side 3 in CAV, as they would typically do. So that's always a nice bonus. But if you want this film on LD, this is the version you'll want to get. Nice usage of original poster artwork, but being Warner, they haven't gone for a gatefold. So there is a little bit of wear on the edges, but nothing absolutely horrible, and especially for its age. It does unfortunately have some cover wear because somebody, I guess, had a big sticker on it that was removed years ago and left some residue. But for less than $1 in pretty good shape, that I can live with that, because usually I see these and they're pretty beat up because of course it's multiple discs in a single pocket jacket. And then of course I had to also pick up White Hunter Black Heart, Eastwood's film from the same year. Somebody seems to have just ripped off the price sticker, but otherwise left all the shrink on, so it was a very nice condition copy otherwise, and again, very cheap. The only problem with this, while it has the beautiful original artwork, is this is not a widescreen pressing for some reason. It is 4:3, so it's essentially opened up. Why they did that, I don't know, but it does have the original Dolby Stereo mix on the digital tracks. This isn't a film I necessarily come back to a lot. It's a very odd sort of film because it's technically based around the idea of basically making a character out of John Huston and the making of the African Queen. And so the film is basically a what if sort of scenario of a sort of amalgam or imagined version of a John Huston type character placed in similar scenarios, and ostensibly from the viewpoint of the writer of the film, which is very much a thinly disguised version of the African Queen. So it's a sort of, it's one of those films that plays around with history and real figures and various legends and things. So it's a very interesting and thought-provoking film, but I don't necessarily know if all of it is entirely based in fact. And it's kind of a weird experience because it's supposed to be John Huston and the African Queen, but they call it different names, and it's one of those it is but it isn't type scenarios. So it's more of like a I mean, technically it's more of the approach of a playwright or a dramatist taking a setup and then sort of using that as your springboard to then make a lot of philosophical points and things. But it was then made into this film that Clint Eastwood not only directed but also starred in and managed to do also in 1990. So I've just been meaning to revisit this, and I figured I'd check out the LD. Again, the only problem is this is not a widescreen transfer for some reason. Next is a film I've read about but I've never actually seen, which is the Albert Brooks film Defending Your Life from 1991. Pretty nice jacket, Warner using the whole jacket for the original artwork. This is one of those films that plays around with the concepts of what happens after death and sort of finding an inherent satirical comedy approach, with also, of course, loads of social satire, and that seemed right up my alley. This is a film I've just read about but never gotten around to seeing. Pretty nice looking Warner release in their traditional style, an actual letterbox pressing, and of course we do get the Dolby Surround track as digital PCM, which is always a great bonus because these films should be heard in their original audio forms. This is another one that was in the free bin. It's in pretty good shape, but it is an X rental, and that's Only the Lonely here in the Fox widescreen edition. This is from, John Hughes was the producer, but it was written and directed by Chris Columbus. But this is another film I've sort of heard of and read about a little bit, but never actually seen. That's a pretty nice looking standard Fox widescreen release. It's in nice shape with some good gloss on the jacket. It's just obviously this was a rental copy at some point and otherwise seems in perfect shape, and they had it in the free bin. So I was like, free Laserdisc? Okay. The rear looks pretty nice, good imagery, a nice little blurb as Fox would always do, and it does have the original Dolby Stereo mix as PCM, so this seems like a nice, solid presentation, and it's always a fun thing to see a film on Laserdisc for the first time, especially when it's got a nice widescreen transfer. Next is the Republic release of Separate But Equal, the film based on the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case that really becomes a sort of a two-man show in the film between Sidney Poitier and Burt Lancaster going toe-to-toe in courtroom sequences. I know I've seen at least parts of this before, but I can't remember if I've seen the whole thing, so I figured it would be cool to check out on the Laserdisc release. This is a pretty nice Republic edition. Even has a nice gatefold with background info and a nice little mini essay. Then the rear is also pretty nice looking. This has a PCM soundtrack, but I believe this was originally done for television. That's why it's in the 1:3:3 ratio. And it was actually directed by George Stevens Jr., of course, who has done great work in the area of film history and preservation. He's done many, countless interviews over the years with many of the surviving greats of the golden age of Hollywood, and is such an important name in terms of film history and has written many different books that are essential reads. So it was interesting to see him turn his hand to directing a number of films, this being one of them. But I've just been meaning to see this again, and it's very late in Burt Lancaster's on-screen career, and so I just figured it would be cool to revisit on Laserdisc and, of course, get the benefit of also having the PCM digital sound. Then, in my crazy desire to see everything the primary James Bond team members and actors did in the rest of their film career outside the series, I also try to see, that means basically I try to see every film the main directors did, the editors, the cinematographers, so on and so forth, but of course also the James Bond actors themselves. So I do try to see, for example, every other Pierce Brosnan film, like 1991's Victim of Love, with this very 90s looking cover. We have two great, very 90s looking shots of Brosnan on the cover. I've seen this image before a lot. I've seen this disc before, and I've just never seen this film, so it's kind of meant to. And it kind of makes you wonder from the title, if I guess somebody was listening to the Eagles a lot, maybe. But it also has a nice sort of Brotarian tagline, which I will, of course, trailer read. There's a fine line between passion and pain. Victim of love. I can't resist these things. But this is in really nice shape. It's got the original shrink wrap. It has a very generic rear cover, obviously, just expanded from the VHS dimensions. This is an image disc. It does have Dolby Surround PCM, but unfortunately this is not widescreen, so this is, I guess, open matted, and it does have their traditional black bar on the top, which usually kind of makes you think it's not widescreen anyway, because anytime you saw the black bar or the little colored bar with the title on top of a universal disc, which is usually where you see that, or Image would do this as well. You see that on top, and you pretty much already know this is not going to be a widescreen transfer. So I've just always meant to see this film. It's just one of the Brosnan films I haven't seen, and figured I'd chip off my list with this Laserdisc. Unfortunately, the same goes for Article 99. This is also not a widescreen transfer. It seems pretty much opened up, but it does have a nice jacket, good gloss on it, and also has the original Dolby Stereo track on the digital tracks. This is a film I've seen the images of. I've seen this cover before. I really like the idea of the lead pairing of Ray Liotta with Kiefer Sutherland, and this is sort of playing around in a hospital scenario with sort of everyday hijinks, making these medical professionals' lives crazy. And of course, this is predating ER, really popularizing that. But I've just always kind of meant to see this, and this popped up super cheap and really nice shape. It looks pretty nice, but unfortunately, the only problem is this is an image disc that is not a widescreen master, which unfortunately you run into with a lot of, well, not just Laserdisc, but in particular image discs. So this is just another one where it's a nice LD, but it's just not widescreen. Next, I picked up Memoirs of an Invisible Man on the Warner Letterbox pressing. This, of course, was directed by John Carpenter and had a pretty interesting, if not quite a bit troubled, production history. It still has a very mixed sort of reputation. And I remember when I saw this years ago, I didn't think too much of it, but I've seen clips of it in the past couple years and kind of read up more about the production. I was kind of curious about seeing it again. This is the Warner release, and they have a spiffier rear cover. If you notice, they went for this very cute approach, of course, making the entire rear this basically white with a nice gloss finish. But instead of having their usual color bar on the side, they have actually made it white, but then also taken the time to actually start fading out the typical photos, of course, because Chevy Chase's character becomes the Invisible Man and constantly fades out of visibility. So whoever designed this was being very cheeky, and I love them for it. So this is the only standard Warner jacket style release that I know of that actually does something unique with the artwork and such. So that alone makes this a nice Laserdisc to have in your collection, just because somebody did something with the generic Warner design, and I love them for it. This is a widescreen transfer and is a single CLV disc with two sides. We do get the original Dolby Stereo track on the digital tracks, but there's no extras or anything. And of course, you do get a nice version of the poster art if you want to display the jacket, but at least we got a solid Warner widescreen pressing. I also picked up the widescreen pressing of Sniper, which is a film that used to play on television and cable all the time, and I know I've seen it, or at least I've seen parts of it a ton, so I figured it would be interesting and kind of fun to check it out on the widescreen Laserdisc, and finally found this copy in really nice shape for super cheap, still in the original shrink wrap, and we even have some Broterian taglines. One shot, one kill, no exceptions. Even have a blurb from People magazine. An adrenaline-pumping, invigorating ... action film. I can't help doing these things. This being a Sony disc, well, TriStar, but still technically Sony, we do have a nice amount of liner notes on the back and a good amount of chapter stops, but it is just a single CLV film-only disc, two sides with the original Dolby Stereo track as digital PCM, so this is the version you want to pick up on LD. Next for 1993 is Arctic Blue. In Alaska, when the nights get longer, people get crazy. And of course you have Rutger Hauer on the front with what looks like a sniper's rifle, so I guess people are gonna get crazy. I simply picked this up because I knew this was a Rutger Hauer film, and I've tried to see anything he ever did, even if it gets wacky and silly, and this kind of also seems to dabble more in Broterian land, but I couldn't resist this super nice copy for cheap in the original shrink wrap. This also is a Sony affair, so it's got some nice liner notes, has a good amount of chapter stops, but no extras, single CLV disc with Dolby Surround PCM. But I do believe, unfortunately, this is also not widescreen, and Sony would even do this at times, so it wasn't just an image thing. And that's really the only sort of knock against this, is that unfortunately it is not in widescreen. Next is the Clint Eastwood picture A Perfect World, which I think is one of his most underrated films, where he not only directs the film, turns in a nice performance, but Kevin Costner pretty much steals the film in one of his best performances, I think. I think this is, again, one of the most underrated Eastwood films, and I always wanted to pick up the Laserdisc when I found a nice copy. So this is the Warner Brothers letterbox pressing with the original poster artwork, which looks really nice on an LD jacket, but this being Warner, they did not opt for a gatefold, so usually when you find this, it's really beat up. It's got crumpled corners. There's a little bit of creasing here and there, but that's to be expected with any of these. This is definitely the best looking jacket of this I've seen before, because usually the copies I see are pretty beat up. This is otherwise standard Warner, but this is when they had updated their rear covers to at least look a little bit more modern, use the space a bit better. We do have the film spread on 3 sides, and side 3 is nicely done in CAV. We have the Dolby Stereo original mix and PCM on the digital tracks. Unfortunately, no extras, but this is at least the film getting a good solid widescreen pressing from Warner with nice artwork. Unfortunately, though, they didn't spring for a gatefold. This one I've seen part of, but never the whole thing, so I picked up Romeo is Bleeding, which also has, in addition to a nice cover with some nice gloss to it, a good Broterian trailer-worthy tagline.
He's a cop. She's a cop killer. This is not your average love affair.
And the rear also has some nice imagery. Again, you have some nice gloss on the jacket. It's still in nice shape, a little bit of corner creasing, but nothing bad. This from Polygram, but this is actually a widescreen transfer with Dolby Surround on the digital track. So I figured this would be a fun way to see this film in its entirety for the first time. And again, the jacket's more impressive than you would think. I also picked up Fox's widescreen release of The Vanishing with this rather nice looking original poster artwork, nicely printed on a very bold choice of going with the complete black cover background. It's a nice rear as well. This is a film I read about, kind of heard about, and I think maybe I saw the trailer once, but I've just never actually seen it, so I figured it'd be fun to check out on the LD. This is in Fox's traditional style that they pretty much nailed down by this point. Nice rear cover, single CLV disc, widescreen transfer, Dolby Surround PCM, and then that's it. So there's no extras, but just not a disc you find all the time, and I just really enjoy seeing 90s thrillers on Laserdisc in nice, spiffy widescreen editions with good jackets. So when I see them for cheap, I kind of enjoy trying one out that I may have maybe missed or just not seen on Laserdisc for the first time. Now this one I did see a long time ago, and I remember it being rather on the goofy side, but it was less than $1 and in good shape, so I picked up the Fox release of The Chase, also in their traditional widescreen style, again from this lot, so it is still in the original shrink, in nice shape. Have the original poster 1 sheet, and then a pretty nice looking Fox 90s action movie rear cover. And this, of course, when you see the back of this, and it kind of makes you think of Speed with the explosions. I think that was that most people are going to think of that in terms of it being early to mid 90s Fox action film. But it's a nice looking jacket, good amount of liner notes, but we're just getting the film with a widescreen transfer, Dolby Surround PCM on the digital tracks, and that's pretty much it. I just figured it'd be fun to check this out again, even though I do remember it being much more on the goofy side. And but it's just I haven't really seen this since I was a kid, and again, I kind of get a kick out of watching 90s action films on Laserdisc. I finally picked up a good condition copy of Color of Night. You see this quite a bit, but it's usually beat to crap and not in good shape. It's got a really nice thick gloss on the cover, but it's not a gatefold, and since there's multiple discs, usually the covers beat to crap. This is an early 90s Bruce Willis vehicle, and this is marketed as the exclusive director's cut with all this additional footage put in it. And of course, they nicely made the top and bottom of the cover red to make it jump out at you more, which is kind of an amusing touch. The rear looks pretty nice. Again, very thick gloss on this. We have a note about this being the director's cut with the 15 controversial minutes restored. So you get a little note about that. The film is split onto 3 sides, and it does include the original Dolby Stereo mix on the digital tracks. But the design of this jacket should be familiar because this being Hollywood Pictures, that makes this a Disney disc in disguise. So this is a Disney Laserdisc, technically, of a adult thriller with 15 minutes of uncensored director's cut footage. So I always find that enjoyable, looking at very not Disney films that technically are Disney releases. So that's always the dead giveaway on the bottom. I also picked up the Western Frank and Jesse, also from 1994. Pretty nice looking cover artwork, although it seems like it's just expanded from VHS dimensions. I've seen bits of this over the years, but never the whole thing, and I figured it'd be cool to check out on Laserdisc. This is a Vidmark release. Not terribly common, I don't think. It does have Dolby Stereo on the digital tracks. Pretty nice artwork, but unfortunately this is not a widescreen transfer, so this is 133. But I picked this up because I've always kind of meant to see it, and I'm a sucker for any Western, whether it's solid or decent, I'll still definitely enjoy it. And then I also picked up the special uncut version of the Getaway remake with Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger. And the idea was you were supposed to see crazier, naughtier bits that were not in the theatrical version, because, of course, they were married at the time of making this. And Universal did actually release 2 nearly identical versions of this. I've actually got the standard version, which looks exactly the same. And the only difference is here, it tells you this is
The special, uncut, unrated version.
and then on the back, it has a little tiny asterisk saying,
Additional footage added here.
and if you look, it is just in chapter 33, because as far as I'm aware, the
Additional, uncut, unrated
footage is like, I think no longer than a minute or two. I think it maybe only is like a minute or so, and it's not really much of anything. So that's the difference, and it's kind of strange. Universal would do 2 completely different pressings of a nearly identical film, nearly identical jacket artwork, and do this. But of course, this was the LD era, and you couldn't do things like seamless branching. But it seems kind of a bit of overkill for such a very small amount of footage. You would think they would just do this version and then maybe have the standard version on VHS or something, but they did do both. So if you want to pick up this film on Laserdisc and you're not paying attention, you'll do what I did and pick up the standard version that's missing the extra minute or the tiny bit of footage. But I just finally found one of these for cheap that was in good shape, and I've been meaning to revisit this anyway because I only remember bits and pieces, but I wanted to actually get the
uncut version.
Next is Getting In, which is a very oddball sort of dark comedy about kids trying to get into medical school and coming up with all kinds of wacky schemes to try and cut ahead of their potential classmates, literally. And then all of a sudden, their would-be rivals also start turning up dead, which is things start to get out of hand, essentially. I've seen this a long time ago, and it's been talked about on the Wolfpack podcast before. If you follow that, this will probably seem familiar. But I've been meaning to get this on LD ever since that episode, because it sort of jogged my memory. Pretty nice jacket. This is still in nice shape in the original shrink wrap. And this is actually a lower budgeted production, so it's not Dolby Stereo, but it's the less expensive Ultra Stereo on the digital tracks, which should be the original mix. And the other reason why I wanted to check this out, and I think the real signifying factor that this is a bit different than your typical comedy, is, of course, this was an early directorial effort from Doug Liman, who has a particular sort of quirky, dark humor in his style that I really enjoy. So that's why I wanted to check this out again. I believe this is a widescreen transfer, but it doesn't say so on the jacket, so I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty positive this is widescreen, or if not, it's probably just another open matte transfer. Now, this is a film I haven't seen in years, so I finally found the actually not too common letterbox pressing of Mixed Nuts, which is the Steve Martin, Nora Ephron comedy. Again, probably better for watching around the holidays, with Sony's widescreen banner across the top. It's in pretty nice shape, and again, I just always kind of meant to pick this up whenever I stumbled across the widescreen version. This is a nice Sony jacket, of course, with a good amount of liner notes, a lot of chapters, but no extras. So newer widescreen master with the original Dolby Stereo track on the digital tracks, and again the spiffier Laserdisc presentation.
What's fast and fun? A rousing action adventure, and a rip-roaring good time that's available in a widescreen letterbox THX certified transfer? The answer: terminal velocity.
Sorry, I couldn't resist. This is the widescreen Laserdisc of
Terminal velocity.
which I feel like you have to say in a trailer voice. I've wanted to pick this up for some time because I remember this being quite fun, and I know DVD Mike from the Home Video Update podcast really enjoys coming back to this, and I watched the other film released at the same time about aerial craziness and a sort of 90s action film on Laserdisc not too long ago, which was Drop Zone. So, and that was kind of a mess and nowhere near as well received as this was. So maybe kind of want to check this out again. And if I was going to watch this, I wanted to find the Laserdisc because, again, I get a real kick out of watching 90s action films on Laserdisc. This is actually a nicer jacket than you would think. The cover is obviously much more on the generic 90s video art design side of things, but on the LD, due to the space, it looks a bit better. You get the widescreen banner on the top. You've got all the logos tucked away here. They even sprung for the THX seal of approval, and you see that little stereo logo, which means, of course, also looking at the rear, this is Disney Disc in disguise, but it looks better than most, and there is some nice gloss on the jacket, so it feels a little bit more premium than most Disney Discs in disguise. It's just a single CLV disc with the letterbox transfer and the Dolby Stereo mix on the digital tracks, which I'm looking forward to checking out. And again, we get the somewhat important THX seal of approval down there. So it seems like a pretty solid disc. It's just one that doesn't always pop up at a decent price in really good shape. So I was happy to finally find one of these that wasn't totally trash looking. Next is Mulholland Falls from MGM in the Letterbox edition. This is the AC3 version. I believe there's also a harder to find DTS version of this. This isn't super common, but it isn't necessarily rare, but it's a spiffier looking MGM disc because it was new at the time. And this film has kind of eluded me for a while. I've kind of heard about it, always meant to see it, and just never got around to it. But it kind of beats LA Confidential to the punch in terms of doing a period cop and crime drama setting in period LA by at least a little bit. And it was directed by Lee Tamahori before he eventually did Die Another Day in 2002. So this is also one more in my Bond personnel other films list of films I've been meaning to see. But the jacket's actually pretty nice. And again, this is the later spiffier MGM because you can always tell by the deluxe letterbox banner on the top being the modernized version. Even has the Dolby Digital sticker still on here because it's in the original shrink. It's not a gatefold or a full special edition, but it has the MGM nicer jacket design, nice imagery, good layout, and a good amount of chapters, but the only real extra is, of course, the theatrical trailer at the end. But I'll be firing this up soon because I'm also very curious to check out the AC3 track because I love checking out AC3 tracks on LDs because you never know when you've got a really hot mix or a very fun 90s mix. So I expect a lot out of every 90s LD I spend, at least in the sound department, because even lesser known, lesser discussed films can usually have a really great, very forceful 90s mix. Speaking of big, boisterous 90s mix, I finally picked up the Signature Collection version of Daylight, the Stallone vehicle from 96. This is the deluxe Signature Collection version with all the extras, and somebody put the original stickers on the actual jacket, which you see sometimes, and while it's not something I would do, at least they took the time to line them up, and at least they're still here, so that's cool, I guess. You have the nice gloss finish on the actual image and the Signature Collection style. I do really like this layout, as I think we all do. This, of course, is also a gatefold, where we have the essay, and director Rob Cohen actually has his signature printed on here for the signature edition. have a nice bit of liner notes, and then we have great imagery with all of the chapter stops, the sides, and then getting into all the extras, which are listed here on the rear and include, of course, the director's commentary, the whole making of documentary, and a whole host of other extras, including trailers, storyboards, EPKs, and various things. But the other thing, in addition to this getting the THX seal of approval, unlike the standard standalone widescreen version that I have, this actually does have AC3, and Universal did that weirdly sometimes where they only put the AC3 5.1 on the signature version, not the standalone version. And then there's also a much harder to find DTS version, but of course that doesn't have all the extras because Universal kind of made it to where you have to get multiple releases to get everything. But this is definitely the spiffiest Laserdisc presentation and just one of the signature discs I always kind of wanted to find because I like getting the signature versions when possible. Also from 96 is the Warner letterbox pressing of 2 If by Sea, which of course is essentially a Sandra Bullock vehicle romantic comedy that I've always seen this image and, back in the day in video stores or different things. And I think I've seen pieces of this on cable over the years, but I'm a sucker for a cheap Laserdisc and getting on into later on in the decade, so this is 96. It's getting closer to being, it's not a late release, but it's getting closer. And I'm a sucker for good, solid 90s widescreen Laserdisc presentations, especially if they're in good shape like this and still in the shrink wrap. So this is later Warner, so you of course get nice imagery and layout design on the rear cover. You do get Dolby Surround on the digital tracks, but while this should carry an AC3 track, this is an example, of course, of Warner or different studios at this time cheaping out and not including a 5.1 option. And they did that a lot on romantic comedies, for example. So basically, if it wasn't an action film, they probably weren't going to spring for it. Or some films didn't even have 5.1 mixes at the time. Some still stuck with Dolby SR for quite some time. So it can be important to have Laserdisc versions. And, these mixes are no slouch. It's just if there was a discrete version, they usually weren't going to spring for it if it wasn't an action film. But I just can't resist nice, solid, getting into the late to mid 90s letterbox Laserdisc pressings when I find them for super cheap. And I still find things like this super enjoyable to just spin up randomly sometimes in between all of the heavier dramas and classics and bigger action films. Now, speaking of action films with AC3, I finally picked up a nice copy of Unforgettable, which is a letterbox MGM pressing. Pretty nice cover in terms of having a nice gloss to it, but the artwork on this has always seemed more on the generic side, and this is actually an MGM disc who usually had spiffier jackets like the Mulholland Falls I just went over. So don't let the sort of genericness of the art fool you. This is actually a 1996 MGM pressing with AC3. This is a film I've always seen floating around. I've seen this image a lot, but I've just never actually seen it. And I've thought about getting it on LD before, but I've never found a copy that was in good shape at a cheap price. And then lo and behold, this practically mint version shows up. Perfect cover, thick gloss on this cover, by the way. The rear, I think, looks pretty good. And this is still MGM, doing their really solid, great Laserdisc pressings. This does have Dolby Surround on the digital tracks plus 5.1 AC3, so you can give your system a workout with your demodulator with this disc. Otherwise, we're just getting single CLV disc, widescreen transfer only, but I've just always meant to see this because of the cast, and this was directed by John Dahl, who made some interesting films in the 90s, and I just figured I'd finally check it out by finding this super minty copy. Of course, I also picked up this film again for I have to see every film Bond personnel made outside the series, so I picked up The Beautician and the Beast because, of course, it stars Timothy Dalton. I know I saw this years and years ago when I was growing up because I was like, oh, it has Timothy Dalton in it. And then you see it and it's not the which you typically expect Dalton to pop up in. But, I figured I'd pick this up. It's not a very common LD, so I was very surprised to find it. This actually is a bit of a special edition. It's a pioneer pressing of a Paramount title, much fancier rear cover artwork, which looks pretty nice. But this does have multi-audio because you got the main soundtrack on the digital digital tracks with Dolby Surround encoding. Then the analog left is, it seems like, I guess, a mono fold down of the audio, and then analog right, Fran Drescher did a commentary track, so you do get a commentary on here. But yeah, I picked this up because it's Dalton, and I have to see or revisit everything he's ever been in. And it's actually a special edition Laserdisc, which I didn't realize, and it's not super common. And we're getting on up there to later in the decade, and I'm sure this will have a pretty spiffy transfer on it. So I figured, why not watch it on Laserdisc? Next, I picked up Deconstructing Harry in the widescreen edition. This is a pretty nice looking cover. One of the better regarded later Woody Allen films, and one I saw years and years ago. So I figured I would revisit it and check out the Laserdisc. This is still in the original shrink, but again, looks like somebody tore off a price sticker back in the day. But I've never seen this before, and this nice of shape, and this is getting on to be a later-ish pressing. And so again, I have a weakness for especially not just cheap LDs, but cheap LDs, widescreen transfers, later era pressings, because sometimes you can find a really nice picture transfer that most people don't talk about and just kind of pass over. So figured I would check this out on LD. It's just the film only, pretty decent cover art, but again, just a single CLV disc with a PCM digital track. And of course, Woody Allen famously didn't like surround and kept with mono for a long time. And then I think some films are kind of almost like a flat stereo, but they're still kind of mono-ish. I can't remember if this is just plain mono or stereo, but he did eventually move into like bare minimum, I think 5.1 territory, but it's still, basically dialogue driven. But I believe this was before he did that, so this would still be mono or flat stereo on the digital track. Next, I finally found a copy of The Edge in the Fox widescreen presentation. Very 90s looking poster on there, I guess. This was written by David Mamet and directed by Lee Tamahori, and that kind of explains some of the over-the-topness it gets to. But I haven't seen this in years. I think I saw it back when it came out, kind of, and a little clips and bits here and there over the years, but I've always meant to revisit it. And of course, this is another Lee Tamahori film in this video, so again, one more checking off my Bond crew other films. It's a pretty nice looking Fox presentation, widescreen presentation in the terms of the mastering, a good amount of liner notes, but it's just a single CLV disc. We do get a Dolby Surround encoded PCM track on the digital tracks, and we also get 5.1 AC3, so this is a good disc to test out your demodulator with. And this would have been ported over master-wise for the film's first DVD, but I'm just happy to finally find a nice LD copy, because I've just been wanting to check this out again, and I wanted to see the LD, because again, getting on to be a later pressing, so I'm sure the picture transfer will be really good. Next, I've got the universal release of Black Dog with a very, very 90s video looking cover, and obviously sized for VHS and just expanded to LD. But we do get a widescreen banner on the top, and again, I'm a sucker for not just 90s action films on LD, but this is a later film, this is a late release, and it looks relatively spiffy. Just the film only on a single CLV disc, widescreen, Dolby Pro Logic Surround on the digital tracks, but also a 5.1 AC3 track. So this kind of ticked all the boxes, still nice condition, still in the shrink wrap, and less than $1, so it had my name on it. I had to also grab the copy of City of Angels they had. I'm not a big fan of this film, and of course it was pretty much a remake of Wings of Desire, but of course it does have its fans, and it is one of the very 90s films that still is in relatively heavy rotation, but it's not a common LD that pops up, because again, this is late release and usually goes for quite a nice amount, and this is still in the shrink. Of course, it has the price sticker area torn off, but it's in really good shape, and especially because this is technically a Warner disc that they once again didn't spring for a gatefold, so it doesn't have any major corner or spine damage, which is cool. And again, it's still in the shrink wrap. This is a nicer Warner release because it does actually have some extras. It has the making of featurette, has a director's commentary. It has a director's commentary on some deleted scenes as well at the end of Site 3. But then it's also got some of the music videos as well, and you'll get the benefit of having those with PCM sound. This does have Dolby Stereo on the digital tracks, but it's also got the 5.1 AC3 and should have a really spiffy transfer since this is a late release. And you don't expect to find this in the dollar bin, so I was very excited, even though I'm not really a fan of this film. Next was a real true surprise to find for this cheap in a dollar bin in mint shape, and that's the standard pressing of Dark City, the widescreen AC3 version with the original artwork, and this was, of course, recycled for the Snapper Case DVD we all had and pretty much still have. This, of course, is the theatrical cut, and I'm pretty sure it's probably the same master that was used for the Snapper Case DVD. The artwork is pretty much the same, but looks nice on an LD jacket. It's just a single CLV disc, widescreen, again with AC3 and Dolby Surround on the digital tracks, but it does have the directors and crew commentary on here, which is nice. So it's sort of, I mean, it's not a special edition, but at least we got the commentary. And this is very much a late release and a disc that does not pop up ever, and certainly still goes for quite an amount, though not as much as the DTS variant, which of course is much rarer and much more expensive. But AC3 tracks are usually no slouch, even when they're the same version as what's on the DTS, and the disc itself and the picture master will be the same. And I've really wanted to see what this looked like for so long that I was so happy to finally find any version, especially since what we have here currently in the US is the director's cut version with the absolutely hideously bad Blu-ray and terrible sound remix. So I do actually prefer the theatrical cut, except for the opening narration, and I've just been very curious about the LD transfer, so I was very happy to find any version of this, let alone a perfectly mint copy for $1. Well, actually 99 cents. So that was amazing to find this. I also found Deep Rising in the widescreen presentation, of course, with Dolby Digital AC3 5.1. I haven't seen this film, gosh, since I think maybe I rented it back in the day, or so. I think, or no, maybe I think I saw it on cable. But of course, starring the late great Treat Williams. It's a pretty nice looking cover, but of course it's another Disney disc in disguise, so the back is a little plain. We get the film on a single CLV disc, widescreen, no real extras, but we do get the pretty boisterous sound mix in 5.1 Dolby Digital AC3, in addition to Dolby Surround on the digital tracks. And this is one of those discs that, it's harder to find. It's not 100%, a rare disc, but it's also a later disc, less quantities printed, and it's a very desirable title. So I've never seen it floating around in the wild before, and certainly nice to find it in this good of shape, still in the shrink wrap. But again, looks like somebody ripped off the price stickers off the shrink. Next, I picked up Desperate Measures, which is a pretty nice, I'd say a really good LD jacket. I've seen parts of this over the years, never gotten to see the whole thing, and as a giant Michael Keaton fan, I was like, I need to finally see this. This is a pretty nice pressing from Sony, still in the shrink wrap in really nice shape. Being Sony, it does of course have a nice little write-up, but it's just a single CLV disc with Dolby Surround on the digital tracks. It doesn't indicate it, but this does actually have 5.1 Dolby Digital AC3 as well. Now, this being Sony, there is always a possibility of it having some rot, and I think certain people have had cases of rot with this, so I will have to spin this up and check it out. I've just always wanted to find this because I've wanted to see this all the way through, and I thought the cover was really nice, so this is finally a copy that I found for super cheap that is really minty. But again, somebody seems to have torn the price sticker off of the shrink wrap, which I find kind of amusing. Now, this is another I haven't seen since it came out, and I don't remember it being very good, but it's also a late release, very uncommon. It was dirt cheap, and it's also got AC3. So I picked up the Fox release of the Dr. Dolittle remake in their widescreen edition. This, again, full-on late release, very uncommon, and it's just a single disc. Still has even a little bit of the shrink left on it, but unfortunately there's a little bit of cover creasing and such, but nothing terrible, and the spines are okay. So I was just surprised and shocked to find all of these late releases just in a little new arrivals bin, and I'm just like, wait, what? So I couldn't just leave this there since I was picking up all these late releases. So I pretty much got all the ones they had. This, of course, is just a single CLV disc, no extras, but at least a nice enough looking jacket. And you can tell, obviously, this is trying to aim more towards the kids and family film market, because that's what this is. And they didn't always jump over to LD. So I guess this was printed in enough quantities for either home theater enthusiasts, or especially home theater enthusiasts who had kids who who wanted something that they could also watch on Laserdisc. We do actually get the 5.1 AC3 track on here, so Fox sprung for that on this, but we also get Dolby Surround on the digital tracks, and I'm just curious to check out the transfer on this. And again, a very uncommon, hard to find late release. I'm not going to leave it there. Next, talking about 90s action films, I pick up on LD because I kind of have a fondness for it. Picked up the release of Firestorm in the Fox widescreen edition. I don't think this is a particularly very good film, but I've always, if I see a minty 90s action film with a 5.1 track on it, I'm going to pick it up, especially if it's cheap. This was still in the shrink wrap. It's in perfect shape. Good amount of liner notes, being a Fox disc, nice looking imagery, single CLV disc, widescreen transfer with a 5.1 Dolby AC3 track, plus on the digital tracks for your backup, the Dolby Surround encoded PCM track. There is, of course, a DTS variant of this that is much more difficult to find and very expensive, but again, this is also getting up to be a later pressing, and I'm a sucker for watching 90s action films with 90s action film mixes on Laserdisc because they're frequently untouched and usually sound better than even later releases and really give your home theater a workout. And in particular, because of, say, because I said that, if you look at the liner notes here, it actually has a really wonderfully cute last line. You have the liner notes, a little bit about the production, and then it just simply ends with,
Now jumping into your home theater, Firestorm.
so couldn't resist. That just sealed the deal. Next, we move even further into late release territory. I picked up The High-Low Country in this widescreen pressing from Image. This is a 1998 film, 1999 pressing. I've never actually seen this, but I've kind of read about it. It was directed by Stephen Frears, screenplay by Waylon Green, and Scorsese even has a producer's credit on it. So this is technically a full-blown late release that you don't see get mentioned or talked about a lot. And I've just kind of always had this on my radar, meant to see it, and again, super late release, so I was happy to pick this up. The rear even has very much the look of the jacket Image did for Saving Private Ryan in terms of the rear cover design, so this very much feels like a full-on late release because it is. We do get Dolby Surround on the digital track, but we also get a 5.1 AC3 track, and you wouldn't necessarily think a film with a cover like this would necessarily get an AC3 track because it was kind of sporadic how, again, some Laserdiscs would have it, and other times studios or labels wouldn't spring for licensing Dolby for 5.1, but you get AC3 on here, and it's a super late release, so I was very happy to find this, and even still in the shrink wrap. Here's a similar late release of The Horse Whisperer in the widescreen edition. Original poster artwork looks pretty nice, and even still in the shrink wrap. This is a 2-disc set, not a gatefold, but thankfully this doesn't have any cover damage or spine wear, so I guess it was good somebody left it in the shrink wrap. The imagery looks pretty nice, and again, this is a late release I never expected to stumble across. I haven't seen this film pretty much since it came out, but it'll be fun to check out the picture transfer on here. We get the film spread across 3 sides, no real extras, but we do get a Dolby Digital 5.1 AC3 track in addition to Dolby Surround on the digital tracks. And again, this technically being handled by Disney because it's Touchstone, it is a Disney disc in disguise because you've got there a blurbage still on the bottom. Now this one is probably the most common of these late releases that I'm going over, but it's very hard to find this in good, clean shape with a cover that isn't totally shot. And for some reason, I used to think this was a really bad rotter because it was Sony, but it's actually not. So I was finally able to get a good, clean copy of The Mask of Zorro with the original poster artwork, which looks stunning on this Laserdisc jacket. Sony even made the widescreen banner red on top. Nice gloss on the jacket, and because this is 2 discs, no gatefold, very thin cardstock, again, most copies you find of this, every once in a while when you stumble across one, they're usually pretty beat up, the corners are shot, the spines are shot and things, so it was nice to finally find a very clean copy with a great condition jacket, and not pay a ton of money for it. This being Sony, we still get a nice write-up. We get the film spread over 3 sides, with side 3 being in CAV nicely, and we get Dolby Surround on the digital tracks, plus a Dolby Digital 5.1 AC3 track. This should be a really impressive transfer. I'm looking forward to seeing what this looks like on Laserdisc. Of course, we do now finally have a lovely UHD from Sony of this film, but I've just always wondered what the LD looked like, and I'm just very happy to finally have a good, clean copy. This one I did pick up. I paid a little bit more than you know the all the rest of these, which were all $1 or less. This was the only one in this video that I actually purchased from Subbody, but it was still not super expensive, and I've always been curious about the transfer. So I finally picked up Disney's Mighty Joe Young remake, which is very much in late release territory, very uncommon, usually goes for quite a little bit, and has a nice glossy cover, even though it's still obviously using the VHS artwork. I saw this back when it came out, but I haven't really seen it since then. And I'm, of course, a giant fan of Willis O'Brien and his work on the original Mighty Joe Young. So I figured now is the time to maybe check out the remake again and look at this super late release. This is pretty much just a bare bones film only widescreen transfer from Disney. Again, very much redesigning the, I guess, the VHS clamshell release designed for kids and family watching for a Laserdisc release. So, of course, we get the Disney blurbage from all their Laserdisc jackets on the bottom. We get Dolby Surround on the digital tracks, and they did spring for 5.1 Dolby Digital AC3, so I'll be checking that out. I've just always been curious because this is a pretty late and very tough to find disc that finally popped up for a cheap price, so I said, okay. Next is a very much forgotten, seldom discussed film today, but it is a super late release. That is Fox's release of The Siege, the Edward Zwick film that it has a lot of interesting elements. I think the script's a little messy. The last time I watched it was on the kind of old Blu-ray master from years and years ago. But I always knew that it was one of the harder to obtain late releases, and this usually goes for quite a bit, simply because it is very much on the getting towards the end of the late release calendar of U.S. releases. Otherwise, it's a standard Fox widescreen edition, except they nicely made the top banner red to sort of, I guess, better blend in with the cover art, which looks pretty nice and seems to replicate the original poster. The rear looks pretty solid. Unfortunately, no extras, just a single CLV disc, widescreen transfer, Dolby Surround on the digital tracks, and they did spring for Dolby Digital 5.1 AC3. So I'll be spinning this up to revisit the film and to check out the transfer in audio, which I'm really excited to check out because this is a super late release. So I finally got a copy of 6 Days, 7 Nights. This is the standard widescreen version with AC3. It's got a nice gloss on the jacket, but this being a later pressing, or a late release, I should say, it's got the very thin cardstock, so apparently the spine got damaged and somebody taped it at some point, but it's not terrible, and otherwise the jacket's in perfect shape. And again, this is not very common and very much a late release. This is also, of course, a Disney disc in disguise, because you have their typical blurbage down here, and we just have a single CLV disc with the film and its widescreen transfer, Dolby Pro Logic Surround on the digital tracks, and Dolby 5.1 AC3 on the right analog channel. There, of course, is a DTS variant of this, which, of course, is much more expensive, much rarer, and I'd like to find it someday. I've meant to revisit this. I saw it back in the day. I saw it on the original theatrical run, actually, and then I've maybe seen bits and pieces ever since. I know it doesn't have the greatest reputation, but sometimes you just need grumpy Harrison. And I've meant to revisit this, so I kind of wanted to wait until I found an LD copy to also check out a late release pressing. And then last, but certainly not least, the find of this, of all the discs in this video, I found this for 99 cents. The Warner release of Soldier in its widescreen super late release Laserdisc edition. This is a very uncommon disc that usually goes for quite a bit, and I've gotten outbid on it before. I've always wanted to see what this looked like. I've kind of waited to revisit this because I wanted to see if I could ever find the Laserdisc. They did make a very early snapper case DVD with the same art, which seems to replicate everything, so it should be the same master, but of course much noisier with the usual early DVD ugliness in terms of transfer quality. But This is not a disc you expect to stumble across for 99 cents, so I was ecstatic to find this. It's in really nice shape, still has the nice gloss on the cover, but of course it's very thin cardstock, so usually it's just like any Warner late release, it's probably going to have dings and corner wear and spine wear, so I was very happy to find this in great shape. The rear looks really nice, and again, it's expanded to Laserdisc dimensions by adding the chapters on the side, and we do nicely get the audio commentary on this. So it's, again, not a special edition LD, but at least we got the director's commentary, which was a nice touch. And of course, they very rarely actually included commentaries late in the day. We do get Dolby Surround on the digital tracks, and we also get a 5.1 Dolby Digital AC3 mix, which should be nice and boomy. I've just been really hoping to find this someday, and hoping I didn't have to pay an arm and a leg just because it was a late release, but I never expected to find it for 99 cents. So this just goes to show you that you should always check your local stores and always check every bin, because you never know when you're going to find Soldier for 99 cents. It was not only fitting that this should go last, but of course chronologically and going alphabetically, it does go last, so I saved the best for last. So those are all of my latest local pickups and store finds. This finally gets me through all the discs that I've picked up from some of the massive lots and collection trade-ins that have happened at my local stores. I didn't intend to pick up this many, but most of them did get marked down to 99 cents or less, and then some were even free because they had various sales and sale days and things. So it's quite a bit, but I certainly never expected to find a bunch of rare titles, and especially late releases, for less than $1. So again, it always pays to check your local store, support them, and check every last box, because you never know when there's a random late release or DTS disc or rare pressing variant that's just floating around there. So as always, I hope my babblings about films, physical media, and the wonderful fun of the Laserdisc format has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do keep supporting your local stores by searching for Laserdisc and beyond. Keep your disc spinning, keep your players going to help keep the format alive, and thank you ever so much for watching.